You seem to argue that there is a real threat of fascism, not exactly as it was in the 20th century, but in a different form with echoes and resonance. I mean, could you just explain how you think that really is possible? Because a lot of people find that mere proposition offensive.
I think the moment where we move immediately to emotions like offense is the moment where democracy really is in trouble. I mean, if we don't understand that democracy, or more fundamentally, the rule of law, is something that requires constant human effort, among other things, a human effort at reasonability. If we don't realize that democracy and the rule of law are not the natural result of history, but buck up against history all the time and require our input, that's when we really have trouble. So I'm a little surprised at the idea that people take offense at the notion that democracy and the rule of law are things that we actually have to build up ourselves. The reason why we know fascism is possible is because it already happened once, and it happened in places that are not so distant from us, either in place or in time. And neither the US nor the UK in the 1920s or 1930s was as politically pretty as perhaps we would like to remember it as having been. Beyond that, it's patently clear that some of the people who are involved in current politics are people who have learned from the 1920s and 1930s and are borrowing some of the tactics of the 1920s and 1930s. That's palpably clear. So no, I think the burden would be rather on those who claim that everything is going fine and the system is fine as it is.
What are the tactics you think that are being borrowed?
I mean, excellent question, because that helps us see some of the similarities as well as some of the differences. So the fundamental tactic which has been borrowed is a rhetorical one. So there's a notorious manual to propaganda which was composed in a Munich prison beginning in 1924, which advises that what you should do in political propaganda is always find simple slogans and repeat them over and over again, with the effect of dividing your listeners into us and them. That has clearly been revived as a tactic on both sides of the Atlantics. More basically, the idea that politics is not about reasoned dispute towards constructive policy, but politics is in fact fundamentally about friends and enemies. That's a basic fascist idea, which was articulated maybe most famously by Carl Schmitt. That has clearly returned as a tactic. One of the things which is different, though, is the actual commitment to changing the world. I mean, whereas fascists were really aggressive, they really did believe in empire and war. Today's people on the far right, or the populist right, are rather passive-aggressive. That is, they ascribe all agency to other people, to the system, to the other side, and claim that everything they're doing is just a reaction to that. And they don't really want to commit themselves to actions that might be risky. They want to put all the responsibility on the other side and claim that they're just on the defensive.
If what they are doing, though, is harnessing the popular will of a majority, what's wrong with what they're doing?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd question the premise. I mean, neither the Brexit referendum 2016, which was non-binding in any event, nor Donald Trump had anything remotely like a majority of the population, or even a majority of people who were eligible to vote. But I mean, the answer to your question is the essence of the tradition of Anglo-Saxon law, going back to the Magna Carta. There's a reason why we have law, and the reason why we have law is that law comes before the king, or in modern times, law comes before the ruler, which means law comes before whatever momentary urges the ruler might say that he is embodying. So if we say whatever we think at this particular moment is what goes, that means we're saying goodbye to law, we're saying goodbye to predictability, we're saying goodbye to the basis of the system that we have. So, I mean, it's very important, in politics as in daily life, not to confuse momentary urges with final decisions. There's a reason why we have procedures in our daily life, just like there's a reason why we have procedures in our politics. And if you go too far on the side of procedures, then you have boring, pointless bureaucracy. But if you go too far on the side of momentary impulse, then you have anarchy and degradation. And I'm afraid it's rather that which is the risk right now.
What about the use of language and propaganda and lies? Parliamentarians have been debating it themselves after a particularly grim session in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. And just today, there's a particularly shocking advertising image being put out by one of the Brexit campaign groups, which portrays the German Chancellor, you know, as a sort of a Hitler-type fascist and refers to Germans as Krauts.
I mean, you asked earlier about common problems in the UK and the US, and I think one of them is our faith that politics will generate its own factual background. I think one of the things we're learning, especially in the age of the internet, is that that's just not true. If you want to have the rule of law, you have to have a factual background, because otherwise we just don't know what we're talking about. We naturally have different emotions, we naturally have different values, but we have to have the same facts so that we can then make political compromises as individuals, as citizens, and as parliamentarians. So I think one of the basic lessons from the disasters of the last few years is that both the US and the UK have to work very hard to regenerate a factual background to politics, which I think above all else means supporting local news and making reporting an honorable and well-paid profession, again, especially locally. When the factual background goes away, it's of course replaced by something else. It's replaced by emotional appeals to identity, to who we are. And of course, the propaganda that you're talking about, defining the British or the English as being not the Germans, or the English and the British as being the victors and therefore righteous, is that kind of effort. And it pushes aside very fundamental questions like, who is behaving well right now? Are the English behaving well right now, or are the Germans behaving well right now? Is it really a good example of English manners and democracy to portray other people in that way, right? For me, one of the fundamental question of propaganda is that it always creates a vacuum of responsibility on your side and puts the responsibility on the other side. They must be doing something wrong. They must be pushing us around. It's not that we're taking foolish decisions that are likely to doom our order. It's that someone far away is doing something in accordance with our national stereotypes of them. That's a classic way that propaganda evacuates responsibility. It makes you feel like you're right, because precisely at the moment when you're doing wrong.
A lot of people, a lot of ordinary people, you know, sort of sitting down watching what's going on in politics, and whether they're in favour of Brexit or against it, and are feeling helpless. Do you think there are there's a sort of a kit of tools that people can use to try and do something about the world that they live in?
It is hard to look out at this big, confusing, globalized world and think, well, I can do something about that. But the answer to your question is, of course, yes. This also goes back to what you asked about authoritarianism today. I mean, authoritarianism today depends precisely on citizens thinking, I can't do anything. It depends precisely on citizens being willing to adjust to the next outrageous thing and call it normal. It depends precisely on citizens thinking, well, there's somebody else or there's some other institution who's eventually going to show up and clean this up. If we take those attitudes, then everything does get worse, because going back to the beginning of the conversation, democracy and the rule of law do not operate by themselves. There's always entropy, there's always erosion working against them. So, of course, what we have to be able to do is A, decide what the things are that we care about, and B, take small actions on a daily basis, which actually pushes those things forward, whether this is as small as speaking up at a pub or subscribing to an actual newspaper and making sure that you're paying for it, whether it's as small as making sure that you're making eye contact with people who you think might possibly disagree with you, whether it's avoiding the kind of language which tends to drive people into us and them, and make sure that you're using a different kind of language oneself. All of those things make a palpable difference, especially if they're practiced regularly by a significant part of the citizenry. We know that those things matter. Those things actually are the kind of backbone of a normal democracy. And of course, it's not just democracy which we're missing, it's also normality.